In fact, one of the cases that I came across, actually, it's the only case I found involving New York City. There was actually a guy murdered in New York City in the late 90s, and the only thing that had been taken from his apartment were a bunch of bell jars filled with black bear gallbladders. And the case to this day remains unsolved, and the feds are convinced that somebody who had been dealing with him in the illegal trade of black bear gallbladders had actually come in and rather than paid him, just killed him and then hopped a boat or a plane to wherever he was going. But the bottom line is we hunt black bears, and there's a sustainable level of hunting. The black bear population in almost every state in the country is doing fine. There doesn't appear to be any evidence to date that the bears that we're killing by poaching them has actually caused a decline in the population. Doesn't mean it's okay, but there's no actual conservation problem that we can point to date. This is more complicated. You guys recognize this? Yeah. So how many of you know the term abalone tides? So abalone out here in the Strait used to be, this is a pinto abalone, also called the northern abalone. They actually used to be so common that there were certain tides that people would actually refer to as abalone tides. And now abalone are, they're very, they're still around and you can still find them, but the state and the feds actually suspect that we're now something on the order of 80 to 90% lower than what the ecological level that we should have of abalone. And it's sort of a perfect story for this purpose, because the fishing of abalone was curtailed in the late 80s. The sport fishing was curtailed in the early 90s. And about 1993 or 1994, a gentleman had gone out in a fishing boat and come back with, diving just like they do with geoducks, and he'd come back with 188 abalone. And he brought them on board his boat, and somebody saw him, and the cops met him at the dock. And he said, "You caught me, I've taken these abalone illegally, but I've got a wife and a kid and a mortgage. I can't afford to go to jail. How can I help you?" And they said, "Well, what do you know?" And he said, "Well, I've been doing this for a really long time. I've probably taken 40,000 of these things over the last few years. I paid for my boat, I paid for my Jeep, all taking abalone illegally." So the cops decided, well, this could be our undercover informant. And they started working with this gentleman as an undercover informant, looking for geoduck poachers and abalone poachers. And until sometime in about 1995, where he went and started his boat, and the boat blew up. And to this day, it's not clear whether there was something mechanical wrong with the boat or whether there was some kind of other issue. But at that point, he basically, he was burned from the waist down, didn't die, but had to go through skin grafts. And the cops decided they needed a new informant. That's where my book begins. And at that, I would love to answer any questions you have. Anybody? Yes?
The Columbia River sturgeon, what's illegal about fishing for them?
You can fish for them, but there are...
You can't sell them as illegal.
Well, yeah, there's a couple different problems with that. There are, first off, there are sort of size and time of year issues, because they want to make sure that you're actually catching adults and not catching them when they're young. They also are trying to figure out a way to make sure you're catching males and not females. And with what was happening in this case is they were catching these fish and gutting them to see if it's difficult to tell if it's a male or female until you're actually on the inside. They were gutting them to see if they were male or female, and if they were male, they just throw them away. If they were female, they take the eggs. And in that particular case, the feds actually think over the course of 5 years, they took something on the order of 2,000 fish. And that's a lot of sturgeon. Sturgeon are big, and there aren't that many of them in the Columbia River. Yes, sir? Oh, sorry. Yes, I need to remember to repeat the question.
You mentioned about sharks, but I read in National Geographic a few years back about them in China. They would just pull the sharks up, cut off their fins, and then just chuck them back in the water. Is that happening here? Do you mention something about that?
Yeah. So the question was, are we actually seeing shark finning here, like he'd read about in National Geographic on the other side of the world, where folks would actually take the sharks, cut them out for their fins, and then just throw the rest of the shark away? And the answer is yes. That does happen in places like Hawaii and the Southeast. This case that this federal agent that I talked to, that he was working off the coast of Georgia and Florida, that's what they were doing. I mean, he basically found a boat that was filled with shark fins with no sharks. And that's how they actually knew, obviously we have a problem and that's why a lot of, if you're familiar with fishing, that in some cases you need to have body parts with you so that you can demonstrate that you're not going in and gutting something for a small piece and throwing the rest back. It's not true with all fisheries, it's just with some. But yeah, that does happen here as well. Yeah.
Well, Craig, you ended your lecture kind of where your book began, as you said. Having read it, I want to recommend it to everyone. It's just a fabulous read, and it is like a detective story. And I don't want to give anything away because there's a plot and everything, but it appears that informants do like to play both sides of the law, to put it that way. And in the course of the investigation that you described, it's revealed that I don't even remember the scale of magnitude of the number of geoducks that are illegally harvested. But what is that level of magnitude, and what might be the ecological ramifications of the disappearance of that many clams?
So the question was, through the story that's told in my book, there's not just a handful of geoducks taken, but in some cases tens of millions of geoducks. And how big a problem is it, and what are the ecological implications? And I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, there are when you sort of string all, just in the course of 10 or 15 year period that's covered under this book, if you string all of these cases that the state and federal agents were working on, there are millions of clams actually taken outside the law. And in some cases, I think the figure that they ended up adding together was something like $10 or $12 million worth in about 8 years, and that's just what's taken illegally. And keep in mind, these things are really valuable. I don't know if you know, but they sell for here in the U.S. anywhere from $25 to $50 each, depending on the time of year. And then overseas, it can get much bigger than that. And the reality is that understanding the ecological implications is really difficult, because the way we determine where it's okay to fish is that the state sends people out, and they send divers out, and they literally survey the ground and say, oh, here's how many geoducks we have here, here's how many geoducks we have here, here's how many we have here. So we take them from here, this one will be fine, and then next year we'll survey over here, and this one will be fine. And so they only know where they're looking, and they're presuming that the places they're not looking, the geoducks are growing wild and growing fine. And somewhere in the middle of this sort of mid-1990s to the late 2000 period, they actually discovered, somebody went down and started looking at places where they weren't intending to survey, and started finding that geoducks that had been there 5 years before were no longer there, and they'd never okayed any fishing. And so sort of recognizing what it means for the population is complicated. At the same time, geoducks are the single largest creature with biomass in Puget Sound. And there's not another creature that sort of adds up in weight in Puget Sound to what geoducks are. But you have to take, ecological systems are complicated. What I was talking about when I first walked in this morning is ocean acidification, which is sort of a byproduct of having too much CO2 in the atmosphere. It actually ends up affecting creatures most they're made with that are shells, because ultimately as the CO2 levels rise, the shells of shellfish can actually dissolve, and it's really hard on larval shellfish, And when you look at things like geoducks and oysters and clams, we don't know anything about how serious that is. So the bottom line is that when you're actually trying to set a rule in fishing, you can't always say, well, if I take this many, nobody's going to notice, it'll be fine. Well, it all depends on how well we're doing in every other facet. And there's a lot we're still learning about the marine environment, even here out in our backyard. Yeah.
I'm just looking at the size of the clam versus this guy's hand. So any idea how old this geoduck is?
So the question was, can you tell by looking how old the geoduck is? And I can't, but you can actually, they can actually tell how old geoducks are by counting rings. In fact, they've actually been able to.
60.
Yeah. you can, geoducks can live up to, I think, 100, I think the oldest one ever was 168 years. I mean, they can live a very long time. And they've actually been able to use them in the distance between their rings, just like with trees, to sort of measure changes in climate over periods, because they can actually tell sort of what things were like and how they were growing. Most geoducks, they don't get particularly huge, but there was one that weighed 14 pounds. I think that's the world record. At least the one that people know of. And what you can't tell if you're not familiar with these things, they stretch. So I mean, that particular clam could actually have a neck that's this long at other times. So it's really dramatic, and I mean they're a lot of fun. Yes.
I was wondering about urchins. Are they poached?
Yeah. She was asking whether or not urchins are poached. And yes, in fact, the gentleman who was poaching the abalone also was caught poaching urchin. So I don't know the scale, because the urchin fisher, I don't even know if we're still fishing urchin here. And are we? Yeah. I don't know the scale. It didn't come up anywhere near as often, but I know that there were cases, at least in the mid-90s, of that. And I know that urchin are poached frequently off the coast of California. Yes?
In your investigative work, have you touched on in any way the issue of funding for Department of Fish and Wildlife and these different entities doing this enforcement? And I know Washington State has dramatically cut the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was pretty much devastated a couple of years ago. So I don't know if that occurred within the time frame that you were writing this book, and whether you talk about the fact that in order to make sure that people aren't abusing these resources, that we do have to have enforcement. And so I don't know if that's touched on at all. Or
so the question was whether or not we've actually, in sort of my course of looking at all this, I talked to folks or came across issues of funding for enforcement. I mean, as you know, that there's so much more in play when, there are political implications and everything else. And the reality is, I've been writing about natural resources for a very long time, and enforcement is almost always low on the priority list. Sometimes it's because you can't actually, it's hard to measure success and failure. I was actually telling somebody earlier tonight, one of the agents in this book went on to be, a few years later, a federal agent in charge of New England. And back there's been a big scandal in the last couple of years because some of the federal agents were going out and were being accused of basically taking on nickel and dime cases. And the fishing industry would come back and they would basically not follow a paperwork rule, and they would hit them with heavy fines and basically say, you can go to court or you can settle now. And it turned into this big scandal. And so, the fishing industry said, well, look, these are folks who are trying to do the right thing, and they're getting smashed. And it had a lot of repercussions politically and with sort of the power of enforcement. The cases I'm writing about are not paperwork cases. These are cases where folks are going out intentionally trying to take lots of things outside the law. And I think in some cases there's a big distinction between the two, and you don't always know that, it's not always clear which is which until you really get in and start paying attention. And once you start talking about funding issues, then you're always going to have somebody say, well, these guys are just nickel and diming us for no reason. It's a complicated issue, and it also depends on the quality of law enforcement. And some law enforcement folks are really good at sort of recognizing the big picture and putting their energy in the place that's going to do the most good. And others, it's like, it's violation of the law. It's a violation of the law. Yes, sir.
You talked about some of the poaching is from contaminated areas, some percentage of it. Has there been any documentation of the health hazard caused by that raise more public awareness?
It depends what you mean by health hazard. So the question was whether or not some of this poaching actually does take place in places where the shellfish beds are actually off limits because they're contaminated. And folks have been caught going in and stealing shellfish from contaminated beds or potentially contaminated beds and then selling them abroad. And there's not that I'm aware of been a case where somebody has actually gotten sick. But the reality is, the reason that you have so much paperwork associated with doing this stuff is so that if somebody gets sick, you can backtrack it to the source and they can stop it. Most of the illegal stuff is being sold to places where it's then sort of sent out into the consumer world with no paperwork. So if somebody's getting sick, it's pretty unlikely that we're actually going to have any of it come back and be traceable. So there's no case that I know of, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right. Well, thanks, Craig, so much for coming. If there's any more questions, feel free to ask Craig. He's around here. Jenny's here with his book, and Craig's more than happy to sign it for you. So thanks a lot for coming. Our next lecture. Our last lecture for this season will be Joe Gatos, and he'll be speaking on bears to barnacle, the incredible creatures of the Salish Sea. So, and there's a date change on that. It will be Thursday the 15th, not a Wednesday.